I'm excited to be here, and I hope that I can be, share some of these great tips, from my time working at HBS in the admissions committee, and then, I definitely want to save some time at the end today to be able to also hear from you and answer as many questions as I can. So you'll see that, here's a little bit about me. This is me. My name's Geri, but you'll also just immediately know that I am from the East Coast by how quickly I talk. So apologies in advance, but I think actually that will help you all tonight, because the faster I can kind of get through my good stuff and my slides, the faster we can get to some of your individual questions. And so it's probably likely I won't get to everyone's, but that's okay. I'll try and do as best I can. And again, I'm really happy to be here, and I hope that these 5 tips I'm about to share with you can really help you as you start along this this big journey. Okay. So first thing that I'm going to talk about, first tip I'm going to talk about is this self-reflection idea, which I'm sure this is nothing new that, you've heard some of this before if you've already been down this path, of starting to do your, work on these applications. You've heard and seen, various articles that are like, hey, you got to do some thinking beforehand. You got to do self-reflection. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and why it's important. I think, if you're like me, the idea of sitting down and spending time on this kind of pre-work, if you will, is kind of hard to accept. It's like, I'm the kind of person who just wants to jump in immediately. Like, let's jump in, let's see what those essay questions are, let's see what the application forms look like, and start writing. That's definitely my personality. I sometimes, have a hard time kind of doing that pre-work. And these are definitely things that take a little bit of time, but I want to just basically say, first off, that it's super worth it. Like, this self-reflection that you're going to do at the early start of this process is, definitely going to set you up for success. And we'll talk about that in a second. But most coaches, including myself, will likely have you do some kind of self-reflection exercise prior to starting everything, prior to jumping into those essays and the rest of your application. And it might sound, it sounds a little hokey. Is this really me? Is this kind of what I want to be doing? But I promise you that it is really worthwhile. Like, when I think about all the clients that I've worked with over the last couple of years, the overwhelming response is like, because I always ask them, was this a worthwhile use of your time? Because it is, maybe an hour or two of a little bit of work that you're doing. I always ask them, is it worthwhile? And, overwhelmingly, they say to me, absolutely. Like, I feel more focused now that I'm, getting into this process after we did some of this work, this, self-reflection work. I actually realized I do have a compelling and interesting story to tell that I wasn't sure I did prior. And so I think it's definitely, you can rest assured that it is worthwhile, of your time to go ahead and do this. And here's why. So this is essentially this early work that you're going to do around sort of some of your self-reflection, and a lot of your, who am I? What do I care about? What am I passionate about? What kind of things are important to the person I am? This is going to all serve as your roadmap, right? So at the end of the day, after this work, the idea is that you have a couple ideas in mind. Like, these are the important parts of who I am, not just, hey, here are my school, obviously all that other stuff, super important, right? Your scores, your GMAT, your GPA, your work history, all of that matters. And that's going to be sort of an inclusive narrative. But this piece also is going to help inform what you want to convey about yourself in your essays, what your recommenders should reinforce about you, and things that you might even want to highlight on your resume. So again, this sort of serves as like your roadmap, as you kick this process off. Now, the next question is, well, I hear this a lot, like, do some of this deep thinking, right? But like, what does that mean? How do I do this? And I'll say right off that there's not one way. Every coach kind of approaches this slightly differently. You'll probably see some resources online about, how do I approach this work? How do I do this kind of thing? But here's one option, right? And here's sort of a way that I often work with my clients is I ask them to start things off with like completing, a set of like discovery questions, I call them, right? And so these discovery questions, it's, first the concrete things, right? It's the list of skills and strengths that you have that you feel like differentiate you from all other applicants, right? Like, these are my core strengths. This is what I'm bringing to the table, right? And this is what I think is, a differentiating factor for me. And then on top of that, so that's kind of the concrete stuff. But then on top of it, you're going to ask yourself all of these other kinds of questions, and you're going to take some notes along the way. These things that you don't typically think about on a day-to-day basis, right? Like, when you look back at your life in 30 years, what would it take for you to consider your life successful? Like, what people and things and accomplishments do you need, to do that? What's been the most defining moment of leadership in your life? What did you learn about yourself through it? And what's going to happen is you're going to write all this down. You're going to do some of this thinking, and then you're ideally either going to review it yourself or review it with another person, a coach maybe, and you're going to start to identify themes and commonalities. And this is going to start to build out that personal narrative that I'm sure you've been, seeing a lot about and that people are talking about. So what I want to do is give you a little bit of like a flavor of what this looks like, what I mean by this. So, at the end of the day, when I'm done with this exercise with my clients, I come back to them and I say, okay, based on everything you've told me, here's some of the things that are coming through to me. Here are some of the themes I'm seeing. Let's talk about all of this. Is this resonating with you? Does this feel like it is sort of the core of who you are? If not, let's talk about it. Let's tweak it. Let's get it to where it needs to be. But this is a recent client that I worked with here. And after sort of reading all of those discovery questions and learning a lot about them, all the way from like, hey, here's where I grew up, here was what my family was all about, here's how I spent my time and my interests sort of from a young age to now, all that good stuff, plus some of those hard, deep thinking questions, right? After looking through all of that, I came up with, these three sort of these ideas. It seems like you're the kind of person who, you go your own way. You're not swayed by what others, do. You pursue things that you're curious about, right? On and on. Like, you tend to take on new challenges. You're the kind of person that tries to take and learn as much as possible, and you take risks and go after what excites you. And then there's these proof points underneath that. Okay, so if this is core to who I am and this is part of my narrative, how am I proving that, right? And underneath sort of these big themes, there's sort of your proof points that are going to talk to these things. So that's kind of what you're seeing here. At the end of the day, this is kind of what you want. You want a couple, major ideas or themes, bullets that you kind of put together with proof points underneath that say, here's the things that I'm going to talk about. Here's of all my experiences in life, I have to kind of narrow in on some things. And these are the things that I feel like most represent me. So that's kind of what you're seeing here. The second thing is all about like, you're the kind of person who can fit in anywhere, you work with anyone, you connect deeply with people. And again, proof points. And then that third thing, you're an adaptable person, you get up to speed quickly, and then there's kind of these examples, that prove all of this. So this is kind of the idea behind, the self-reflection sets you up for success. So hopefully this gave you like a little bit more, useful tips around like, how do I approach this? How do I do this kind of thing? Okay, let's think about the next tip. So the next one is, essays are about the who and the why and less about the what. And what this really means is sort of what is in this takeaway here. And I did not write this. This is from, the great resources from Leland, but I thought it was such a good job of sort of pulling this idea together, which is that, most of the components of your application, right, are all about what you've accomplished, all about your achievements, right? It's test scores, it's your awards, it's your, professional history, it's all that good stuff, which is super important to this process, of course, right? But the essays are about showing the AdCom who you are, right? This is really where, you're gonna pull out sort of your unique part of who you are, right? You are a person who has your own set of, doubts and interests and insecurities and dreams. You're not an application, you're a human. And so it's always good to keep in mind that, admissions committees are looking to fill their schools with great people, not great apps, right? So, because how they're thinking about it is, this is a person we're bringing into our program. They're going to be in a classroom with plenty of other wonderful people. And we want to know they're going to be a good community citizen, a good person when they're at our school, a good person when they're outside of our school, and they're going to represent us well as an alum. So it really is, the essays are a chance to kind of share that piece of your story with them. And so here's a little bit more about kind of the basics around what I mean. So first thing is a laser focus on the actual prompt, the actual questions being asked when it comes to those essays. So, it's funny, like before every season, the admissions committees sit down and they talk about their essay prompts and they go into great detail. Is this the same? Do we want to ask the same question next year? Do we want to tweak 2 words here? Do we want to start from scratch and ask totally different questions? They really think a lot about what their particular questions are, because they feel strongly that like they have their own way of discerning the key applicant qualities that they want to get from these essays. And so, they've put a lot of thought into this. They feel like that particular question is the question that's going to help them get to what's important. So you want to make sure you're speaking to what they're asking to specifically. Sometimes these questions have 3 parts. Make sure you're answering kind of each part of that. I think the other thing is that I don't mean that you can't share content from essay to essay. You definitely can. But you'll notice that each of the schools they have a little bit of a tweak in how they ask their questions. And so be thoughtful about those differences in how they're asking, because it really does matter. And they never want to think that you took this essay from this school and plopped it into their prompt. They want to know that you've really put the thought into their particular question. So get personal and storytell. I think, this is a little bit about what I've been talking about so far. Like, this is where this kind of prior introspection work that we just talked about, this is where it all comes in. Like, if you've done that work, right, then you'll really be able to convey in these essays who you are, what you care about, what makes you tick, right? This is really a good chance for you to tell your story. This is your only shot is kind of in these essays. The rest of it, like I said, is that it's that stuff that kind of is more solid about your accomplishments. And that stuff is hard to make a story out of, right? It's hard to make a story out of your resume. Like, the essays are your chance to really sort of show them another angle, another side to you. I think the other thing is, ask others for input. Some of these essays, you're getting personal. You're talking about your passions. You're talking about what you want to do. It can be tough. And sometimes people are a little bit hesitant to maybe share with friends and family. But honestly, and I agree that there is a point at which it's too much. You may not want to ask 10 people. That may be too far, and then you're going to be running in a bunch of different directions. But I do think there is value in asking 1 or 2 people that have known you for a long time, that know what you're all about, and that when they read this, they can say to you, you know what, this really does sound like you. Your vibe is totally coming through here. If I read this essay, I would know it was you. I think that's what you're trying to kind of get from them a little bit. And so if you direct them on kind of what feedback you're looking for, I think some of that, going to some other folks that are really close to you can be really helpful. One thing I think, being as a coach, I've kind of seen a lot of is, what can be successful is being really flexible. So when it comes to these essays, and trying not to get too overly tied to your initial idea, right? So sometimes, you have what you think might be a great idea, but you've worked on it and you've worked on it with your coach, and after spending time, it's just not working. And what I've found is that if you're flexible and willing to let go and maybe do a little bit more brainstorming, and you have a willingness to kind of pivot, often sort of the new idea, the better idea is uncovered. So I think there is, something to, hey, let me work through some of these initial ideas, but if it's not getting where it needs to go, let's start from scratch and let's pivot, which, certainly means that you need to leave enough time for yourself as in this process to be able to do that. And the last thing I'll say, which I feel like is so hard, but is to try and avoid the comparison game. There's so much information out there, about these are the kind of profiles that get in. These are the kind of essays that are, the ones that get people in the door. And there's so many examples out there. And I think, there's the good and the bad. There is some value to sort of reading a handful of example essays and getting a sense. But then there is sort of a point at which things can kind of, end up being more harmful and throw you off your game, because you're like, that's not me. I don't have that story. I don't have something like that that's happened to me. So as best you can, I think it's fair to do a little bit of looking and then kind of walking away and saying that's their story. I have something totally different to share that I'm bringing to the table. Okay. A little bit more on this, tip about essays are kind of about the who and the why and less about the what. So this is a little bit about sort of how the type of essay prompts that you'll see out there and why AdCom uses them, right? So this is kind of what I was alluding to a little bit earlier about this, the thought that they put into these exact questions. There is a real reason behind, why they're asking these particular things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So generally speaking, right, there's these kind of 3 big buckets of the types of essays that are being asked. It's, there are a handful that fall outside of these buckets, but I would say this is the majority of them, right? There's the personal statement bucket. There's the why our school and or, what do you want to do with your career? And then there's the behavioral prompt, right? So those are kind of the 3, bigger buckets. So when I'm talking about personal statement, That is an example of that is like GSB is what matters most to and why, right? So for those kinds of questions, what AdCom is looking to do is, again, sort of similar to what I said earlier, they're trying to get some information from you outside of your resume and your scores and your awards. They know what that looks like. Great. You have a ton going for you on that front. But then there's this piece that they can't get from there, right? So they want a deeper look into your character. They're trying to figure out what's the right question that's really going to show me what this person is all about, right? Can they show that they have some self-awareness about what they've done historically and where they've been? Have they grown from their experiences, both professionally and personally? Do they have a passion for something? Are they, eager about learning? This is a chance. These personal statement ones, I think, are great because it's really a chance to show a totally new and different angle to who you are. They're a little bit harder, I think in some ways. Everyone has their own opinion on this. I think probably in some ways it's a little harder from the, from the applicant standpoint because it's so broad. It can be so many different things. But there's a reason for that. They want you to tell them what's important about you. They don't want to direct you exactly on that front. So that's the personal statement. The next one is the why our school, and oftentimes that goes hand in hand with the career prompt. So, like Wharton's question, how do you plan to use the Wharton MBA to help you achieve your future professional goals, right? So I think this one you see fairly often across a bunch of schools, and yes, I think on its face, this looks kind of straightforward, like it's a test of your knowledge and love for the school, right? And that is, I think, fair in some respects. But really, more importantly, it's about convincing the admissions committee that their specific school, all the things at their school, the faculty, the culture, where they're located, all the academics, tie directly to your career goals. So you going there, you want to kind of not just say general things. Like I think what, oftentimes what I'll initially see on someone's first attempt on this kind of essay is that they kind of talk in more generalities, like this school, has an amazing network that's going to help me, get the job I want. I love the leadership curriculum, and as I grow as a leader, I'm going to need that. Or, there's an amazing global student body here. But if you think about those things, right, they could almost all be said for any top business school, and so I think the schools read that and they're like, well, I'm still not convinced that this person knows they want to be here. They just want to be at an MBA program somewhere. So you want to really convince them like, no, I know exactly kind of what your school brings and how that's going to help me get to where I want to go specifically, and so the more granular and kind of detailed you can get in there and tie it to your, goals, the better and the more convincing it will be. And then lastly is, the behavioral prompt, which most people I think may feel more comfortable with because these are very similar to, lots of questions you've gotten as you've been interviewed anywhere, right? So it's the same kind of behavioral questions you get then in an interview. So for Kellogg, the example here is describe a specific professional experience where you had to make a difficult decision. Just like in the interview, what they're doing with these is they want to use your past experience as a proxy for how you're going to handle future situations, right? So they are, but it's a little bit more than just, hey, give me a prior example where you can kind of, show this experience. They're looking to see a little bit more in depth, like, can you illustrate through that, like something about your character, about your personality, can you show learning along the way that, hey, I did have this experience, of making a difficult decision, and this is what I took away from it, and here's how I'm going to use that learning going forward. So it's, they're trying to get a little bit more, in depth there, in terms of those kinds of questions. Okay, let's move on to the next tip. I think the next tip is to rethink your resume. The last time you probably put together a resume is because you were doing a job search, which makes complete sense. But this resume, for the purposes of the applications here, the MBA applications, is likely going to need some tweaks. So first, I think, big picture, you want to make sure you're highlighting skills and impact, not just responsibilities. So again, this is one of those things where I think typically the first take of a resume is often very responsibility heavy, right? It's kind of bullets about what you have to do. And that's, it's okay. Obviously there needs to be some of that. They need to understand what it is that you are responsible for, certainly. But you want to really highlight more in every single bullet what you're sharing is highlighting some sort of skill you're bringing to the table and the impact that you've made at the organization. That's really the way to kind of think about it. And so through those skills, what you're trying to showcase here in this like first box, all the typical things that you know, right? Like the MBA programs you're looking for, right? Leadership, collaboration, the ability to persuade, problem solving, quantitative and analytical skills, all that good stuff. So as you write, as you look at each bullet, you say to yourself, okay, which skills of mine is this highlighting here? And you're not necessarily going to say it at, hey, this is, showcasing my leadership skills, but you're going to be able to say, think to yourself, are some of these skills coming through? If yes, great. You check that box. And then ideally, and not in every single bullet, but ideally, you're also going to be able to show, okay, through that strength that I just, I'm also indicating here in this bullet, here's the impact I made on the team, on the people, on the organization, all of, those kinds of things. I think though that's the, most important piece. Another thing to think about is that these resumes are being reviewed pretty quickly. So, the readability is super important. And maybe I might argue even more important than a resume for a job search, because, here, this is one small piece of your entire application that you're submitting. And we know that, admissions committees take about 15 to 20 minutes to look through your entire application. So you want them to be able to really quickly look at this and scan it and immediately know, okay, I see where this person is working now, and what year, how long they've been there. I see promotions. I see where they worked prior. I know where they went to school. I know what they're interested in, outside, or what they've done outside of work. Super, you want that to kind of just be super easy, which that all means that you want to have some white space, which I know is hard because oftentimes when I'm reading resumes, they're super dense, right? There's very little white space. But I think the tough thing about those dense resumes is they're super hard to get through. And so, what you want to do is, not think of this as an exhaustive list. This is not like, your resume is not an exhaustive list of everything you've ever done at all your organizations. It's really, can I pluck out, the 5-6 things that are most impressive that I've done at each of these places, and those are what I'm sharing, and that way they're just getting the good stuff, right? They're just getting the best stuff. So that's how you want to think about it. And I think the other thing, these are just my sort of personal, opinions. Some people might disagree, but I do think that phrases are better instead of sentences. Certainly you don't want paragraph form, and you want to remove outdated stuff. So if you're talking about stuff that's been on there for a long, long time, better to remove it so they're not getting lost in sort of stuff that's unimportant, the ACT stuff and, basic skills like Excel, you can take off all of that. So that's, another, tip here when it comes to rethinking your resume. I think the other great thing about the resume that sometimes is overlooked is that it's an opportunity to mitigate any sort of challenges or issues that you might have in your application, which, by the way, everyone has something, right? No one's application is like, I've got it all. I've got all the things. It's all perfect. Everyone has something that they need to see if they can, mitigate in some way. So, the example that I put here on the slide is like, if you don't have a great, quant score, right, on your GMAT or GRE, you can use the space in your resume to showcase when and how you use data to drive decisions, right? So at least AdCom says, okay, I see that the score here isn't fantastic, but when I look at the resume, it looks like she's been doing some really, intensive work with, large amounts of data and analyzing it and making decisions, and it's, making it a big impact on the organization. So you can look at it as a way to mitigate, anything that may be, less strong in your application. And the last thing I'll say is that, unlike a resume that you might be using to job search, this is a chance actually to show a little personality. And I always tell people to add an interest section. To me, that was always the most fun. When I was on the admissions committee, that was one of the first things I would look at, because it just gave such color to who the person was. It showed me like what they were all about, outside of their professional experience. So, you can add so much like fun and color to your profile by doing that. So easy. And so I shared a couple of my favorite ones here. You can see I have, somebody had on their interests, hot pot connoisseur, optimistic New York Knicks fan, and competitive Settlers of Catan player. Like, that's fun. And that's telling me some interesting things. And you can bet that when I meet that person in an interview, I'm going to ask them about that, and so it just also, gives the potential interviewer, also things to kind of refer to and talk about. And then you can see my other one. There was another one that recently came up with a client of mine that I like, electric cars and blues rock, anything with 4 wheels and 300 horsepower and beekeeping. Like there's a lot I want to know there, from this person. And it just, shows that they have a lot of breadth. So that's kind of the rethink your resume piece. All right, let's move on to the next one. So the next tip is, your career goals should be clearly defined, logical, and ambitious. Like these, I think, are the three most important things when you think about this process. Pretty much every application is going to ask for this information somewhere, right? It's either going to be directly asked in an essay, or it's going to be asked, in a short answer, or both, right? So you're not really going to be able to get around this question, so and it is something important that the schools care a lot about. They want to know that the people they're bringing in the door are going to make the most of this institution that they're getting access to, right? So you want to prove to them, I've really thought this through. I have a logical plan based on my past. It is clearly defined. I know where I want to be, and I have big goals. Like, these top schools, they want people who take big swings, who have big dreams, to make a difference. So those, I think, are, just big picture, how to think about this. So a little bit more granular, anyone reading about your goals should be able to understand them, right? Without any prior background or knowledge. So just assume, yes, these admissions committee folks have been around for a while. They've probably, have read everything. But you don't want them to have to look anything up to kind of think, I'm not really sure what she's saying. You just want to simplify as best you can. I think the other thing is to, if you can paint a picture for AdCom, like especially, if your career goals are niche or a little bit more technical, you want to bring it to life so they get it quickly. Again, you don't want them to kind of walk away saying, I'm not sure I fully understand these goals, or you don't want them to have to do any additional steps to figure it out. I think the other thing is, being as specific as possible, right? So as much as the more solid sort of your plans are, the better. So if you can talk about, the industry, the sector, the type of company, the type of role, you might even know the type of title you want to have or the title you want to have. I think the one caveat is just imagine whatever you say here, whatever you talk about in terms of, hey, here's my goal, you want to be able to speak to all of it if you're to be interviewed, right? So anything you mention here, just assume you're going to be asked about in an interview, and they're going to try and kick the tires a little bit to say, all right, let's see, does this person really know about this sector? Do they know what's happening in it? Did they read the latest article on it? Did they, all of that stuff. So you want to be able to stand behind what you're saying. Here's a great example that I just included here of, something, the career plans that a recent client put together that I just thought was, we kind of pulled this together, and I thought it was super strong just because it made it so clear. So, I'll quickly, read some of it. So I aspire to improve access to formal credit avenues and financial services for micro enterprises owned by low-income families and women entrepreneurs in Southeast Asia who are targeted by predatory lenders. Like short-term, I want to launch a fintech startup. Long-term, I'm going to invest in fintech startups through VC investments. What I love about this is it goes from big to small, right? So it's like big, here's what's going on in the sector that I care about and where I want to make an impact. And then short term, here's how I see that playing out. Here's how I'm going to be involved in this. And then longer term, here's like the big role that I want to have. And it got even as what I also like here is the EG, Morgan Stanley Inclusive Venture Lab or Quona Capital. That means that the reader goes, oh, I know immediately what they're saying. Sometimes giving an example like that just makes it that much easier for the AdCom to understand. So this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And I certainly know that some schools might not give you this many words, so you might have to shrink it down a little, and so it's a matter of kind of how do I get this across? In this particular example, this person, had enough words to do it. Okay. So the last tip is is really about recommendations. And I'm talking here about, being intentional about the content of your recommendations, in addition to being, of course, thoughtful about your recommender choices. Like, I feel like there's probably a lot of, things you've already seen about like how to choose your recommender and who the best recommenders are and all of that. But I think there's a little bit less maybe said about the content, right? And what can be done with this content. So, what they should be about. So I think it's super important to, plan carefully, like what exactly you want these reps to talk about, and then prepare them to do so, right? If you think about it, like these recommendations are another like really great opportunity. It's almost like another couple essays, right? But they're even better because it's someone else gushing about you versus you gushing about you, right? So, it's a really great opportunity when they're done well. And so here are a couple things that you can think about when you think about the content of, being intentional about the content of your recommendations. So there's a couple things you can do with them, right? This is a chance to, again, just like with the resume, right? This is a chance to mitigate any kind of application challenges. This example here is like someone who had a low verbal test score. So she made sure, this person, when they were talking and preparing their recommender, that they had an example where this person can talk about how strong her communication skills were, right? So, Liza's a strong communicator relative to her peers. She presented to the investment committee. She led management diligence sessions. She presented investment theses to, through memos and, email and written. So this is a great example. So again, if I'm the admissions committee, I say, okay, I see this low verbal score, but look at her rec really saying how strong she is on the communication front. Like this may just be an issue of like, she's not a super strong test taker, that didn't go really well, but she's got the skill set. So again, the recommendations are a chance to mitigate application challenges. The second thing they can do is, obviously, this is sort of the big one, right? This is the one that I think everyone, is typically aware of, but you just want to make sure you're paying attention to, which is reinforcing your narrative, right? So if part of that narrative, like the one we talked about, earlier in the slides, if part of that sort of story and narrative that you've pulled out is, say, you're really an innovative problem solver, and that's going to be core to kind of what you're talking about, you want to make sure your recommender is saying the same, right? Yes, you know what, this person has sort of highlighted for themselves that they are really an innovative problem solver. And look, their rec is also showing that they're saying the same thing. It's reinforcing that message. So, this one was about sort of a college student who, approached this company, the first to kind of ever do that, and came up with a whole plan to have, interns from Cornell University, help the firm, et cetera. And it was sort of, something new that hadn't been done before, and it was helping the firm and helping the students. So again, like they found a way to become, to innovate and solve a problem. So, again, you want to make sure your recommender knows what you're highlighting, knows what your narrative is, so that they can make sure they're reinforcing it. The other thing the recs can do is to reinforce fit for the program. So, every program's got kind of a little bit of, certain things that they care about, a little bit of their own culture or vibe. If you know that the school you're applying to really cares a lot about community and teamwork, right? Then let's, have your rec talk a little bit about that. In this case, like, Everly is the consummate teammate. She inspires and motivates, like talking about her positive energy, her approach to things. She creates long-lasting, high-trust relationships. She created this weekend update segment that kicked off team meetings, to allow people to get more connected to each other. So again, like the school, the AdCom is thinking, wow, this person's going to be great for our environment. This is the kind of person that, we care about, someone who is involved and cares about the people around them. Community is big for us. So, they're not straight up saying, hey, this person, is a great team member. Like they're involved highly in the community, but they're giving a great example that's reinforcing that message, that fit for the program. So, just a couple great ways that you can really use your recommendations to their fullest, right? And then, connected to this, still talking about the intentionality of your recommendations, I think this is a bit about what I kind of referenced just a minute ago, which is this preparation piece. So, I think certainly this gets a little tricky, I understand, because you're asking somebody to do something for you, right? You're asking for a favor, essentially. You're saying, hey, I'm applying to business school. Can you serve as a recommendation? Can you write a recommendation for me? The person says yes. And you're so thankful, and you don't want to bother them, and you don't want to bug them. But really, if without any sort of help or preparation, they may go off and write a lovely recommendation, but it's not necessarily going to do all those things we just talked about, right? So it's sort of a missed opportunity if you don't prepare them. So there is on Leland, there's a great free template that you can access on Leland. That's sort of how do you prepare your recommenders? So it kind of lays things out for you, gives you some examples. So that's a great thing if you're, interested. And you create this document, you either walk it walk through it together with them, or you send it to them and say, hey, here's everything you need to know about, my applying to business school, as you start to do your recommendations. First thing though, before you even do this, which I should have said, is like, you want to make sure your recommenders are 100% on board and committed to the process. I think sometimes you might get a vibe from someone like, they might say, yeah, I can do this. I'll try and get to it when I can. I'm pretty busy the next couple months. Then that may be a sign like this person isn't all in, or if they say, what, like, I don't really believe in business school. It seems kind of unnecessary. Then you want to run the other direction. Like, you want to only pick people who are going to go to bat for you, that think you are the bee's knees. Those are the people you want. So I think first, that's the first thing. Make sure these folks that you're going to are 100% committed and on board. Now, of course, you can't, all of this, right? You all know, like, you can't write it for yourself, but what you can do, what is totally fair and, no issue in terms of the admissions committees, is that you prepare your recommenders, you share lots of info with them, right? So that they can write the best possible recommendation for you. So that's that preparation document that I was, referring to before, that you can download, but you're going to tell them things like, hey, here's why I want to go to business school. Here's what my long-term goals are. Here's the narrative. Here's my story that I'm going to be talking about. Here are the strengths that I would love for you to reinforce for me, that are going to complement all of my pieces of this. Here are projects, just as a reminder, especially if it's been a little while, here are projects that we worked on together, and the last thing is there's almost always a question about feedback that this person has given you. What's the feedback from this recommender, and how did the person react? You want to give them some ideas around that too. Like, hey, I remember we had a conversation and you provided this feedback to me, and here's how I handled it. So you're just giving an outline for them. You're giving them all the information so that they can go off and do and write a great recommendation. All of that is within bounds and totally fine, and is going to result in sort of the best, strongest recommendations for you. So that is pretty much everything in terms of my 5 tips. I hope that this was helpful. I hope you learned some, there was a couple things in there that you hadn't heard before, a couple things that are going to help you along the way. Here is also just a code. If you end up kind of, working with me on any kind of package, then you can get that $100 off. I know also this is going to be sent out after, so, don't worry about kind of grabbing any of this now. But yeah, this is sort of, what I wanted to share. And then, I think we have at least a few minutes to try and answer a few questions. So I am going to stop sharing and then see if I might be able to, answer a few questions that you all have. I hope I tried to talk fast. I hope it wasn't too fast. But I'm happy to hear from any folks that might have something that they think would be helpful for the group to hear in terms of questions. Let's see, I'm just looking in the chat to see if there's anything. Okay, somebody wrote, I'm worried my GMAT score might not be high enough. Is there harm in applying for round 2 this year, not getting into a program, then applying again next year with a higher score? Does applying twice hurt me? So this is really an interesting question, and I see this come up a fair amount, actually. I think the tough thing about applying so quickly, one after the other, is that there's not necessarily enough time that's gone by to convince AdCom that you are, yes, your score has been raised, and that's great, but the rest of your application is probably quite similar because not that much time has gone by. So it's a little bit hard to get over the hump to convince them, hey, even though we said no to this person last time, now there's enough here, we want to say yes to them this time. So, to me, it's often worthwhile to kind of do the work now, get the, work on the GMAT score, get it to where you feel like it can be, and then apply in round 1, rather than applying now and then again. Yeah, and that's especially true if you get to the point, this isn't exactly in your question, but it is relevant. Like, it's especially true if you get to the point of interview. So if you apply now, let's say in round 2, you get to the point of interview, but you don't get admitted, then you apply again, it's very unlikely they're going to then sort of invite you to interview again. because they kind of already saw you, and similar idea, they assume sort of not that much has changed since the last time. So I think it's, just something else I wanted to mention in there. Okay. Let's see. Would it be repetitive if you listed your interests in activities section? So there is always overlap, almost always overlap, right? Between what's in your resume and what's in the, activity section in the actual application form. And that is completely fine. So if you have a couple of things that are listed in multiple places, not a big deal at all. That's to be expected. I think oftentimes, your interests are sort of in a section in the resume, and that's sort of more fun, hobbies, whatever. And then your extracurriculars, your volunteer work is usually what's put in that section, in the separate section in the application form. But they might also be in the, activities and extracurricular section on your resume too. So, and that's totally fine. So yeah, the expectation is not that every piece of data is going to be, unique. There's some overlap there. Okay. Can networking with alumni or others at that B school be helpful? So what I think about when it comes to this kind of thing is that it is helpful for you as an applicant. It may help you create a stronger application. So it's not going to make a difference necessarily to the admissions team. It's not like, hey, you meeting up with alumni and learning about their experience at the school, and hearing from them, how it's helped their career. They're not going to then go now necessarily and talk to the admissions committee. But it is helpful because you're sort of understanding a little bit more every time you talk to someone, right? You're understanding a little more about what the classroom was like, what the culture is like. And so when you go to write your essay about why this school, or you go to write your essay, your personal statement, you kind of now have a even stronger sense outside of what might be written on the website. You have a stronger sense of how you want to say certain things or what things you want to talk about in your essays. So I do think it is helpful to do that work, just because it's going to help you write, your essays that much better, and kind of put your app together overall. But I wouldn't say it has a direct effect on, admissions in any way. What's the best way to research schools and learn about the school specific nuances? So I think first thing, is definitely and I'm sure all of you have already done this. This is kind of step one, right? You go to the website, you check out kind of the list of courses that they offer. You check out the list of clubs, you watch all the videos that when they share that of their, current students or, recent grads, the more you do that, you start to kind of get a sense for what the place is like. The other thing that I think is great is oftentimes the various clubs on campus have options for you to reach out to the club president or whatever, and just create, have a call with them or meet them if you're local. So I think also connecting with folks that are, at the various clubs as current students can also be a good way, because they're right there every day. So you really can kind of, they're going to start to talk. They can tell you a little bit about, this is what it feels like to be in the classroom. This is what, it feels like to be on campus. This is what this place is all about. So I think, talking to current students is often, also really helpful. The other thing I think is if you can, go to an info session on campus, great. If you can't, definitely do the online webinars, that admissions runs. I think a lot of those webinars, a lot of it's kind of like basic stuff. You're like, yeah, I kind of heard this already from what I read on the website. But there's often, I recently went to I try and go to all the webinars every cycle. And I recently saw MIT's Sloan one. And there was a couple things that the admissions person said that was gave me sort of a little nugget of information that was worthwhile. So I do think just, going to those webinars that the admissions office, provides is a great thing if you can't, be on campus to get it, which is totally fine. So yeah, those are sort of a couple things I think you can do to get a sense. It's really, and then alumni too. Like if there's alumni that happen to work with you, have coffee with them, sit down, see what they say about the place. All these little things start to add up, and you start to kind of get a pretty good sense for the vibe. Is this a kind of place where I see myself, So I think all of that can help. What's the realistic timeline to prepare for GMAT for a busy professional like a strategy consultant? Yeah, I mean those it's hard when you have those really time consuming, those jobs where you're working crazy hours and you don't have a ton of time. I think the sooner it kind of depends, I guess, is the answer. One is, are you a good test taker, right? If you're naturally a good test taker, then you need less time, right? If you're someone who that's not really your strong suit, then I would say you probably want to start like 6 months ahead, to make sure you have a chance to do a bunch of the test runs, the practice tests, get a sense for what's working, what's not. Maybe even work with like a GMAT or GRE coach, for a short period of time if you feel like that would be helpful. So starting early, especially if you're someone who this is not your strongest, part of your application, or it might not be, I think that's sort of a good time frame. And that way then ideally, best case scenario, you've done all that work, you've taken the test prior and had a solid score that you feel good about prior to having to start everything else in the application. Because once you get into all the recommendation work and the essays and the application form, doing that in addition to studying for the GMAT is just too much. Like it's just, if you're, a working professional who works many hours. So I would say, that's what I would suggest. Okay, I think last question that I'll take, which is establishing contact with the AdCom prior to submitting applications helpful? What are the ways to do it? So this is also one of those depends questions. Some schools will ask, what has your interaction with the school been? And they want to know, hey, what events did you go to? What webinars did you listen to, et cetera? And you can see the question in the application form. So when you create an account and you go into each application form, you'll take a look and see if that question is asked. If it's asked, then that's a school that kind of cares about those things, and you want to make sure you're attending because they are asking. Then there's other schools who don't ask at all, they don't track it, it doesn't matter. So, you don't need to necessarily do it unless you're trying to, like I said, sort of, glean a little bit more info from, about the school or the culture. So I would say it kind of varies, but you can find that out by whether or not they ask that question in the application itself. Okay, I think that's all we have time for. But I want to say again, thank you all so much. I hope you found this useful. I hope you got a couple good tips out of it. And, have an amazing rest of your day or end of your day or beginning of your day, depending on where you are. And I wish you, the best of luck through this whole process. Yeah, thanks again.